Hi, everyone. I'm excited to talk to you today about how, as product managers, we can facilitate better decision making in our respective companies. So let's get started. I want to start with a quick introduction. I have had the unique opportunity of working in companies of different sizes. Some companies that are really 0 to 1, like the one I founded here called Common Job Test. Another company like Turo, which has millions of users, sort of pre-IPO, mid-stage startup, and Facebook, which obviously has billions of users. And that's provided me the unique opportunity of seeing how decisions were made in a lot of these different settings and also across countries. And I want to share those learnings with you here today. So we all know that decisions are super important for a company's success. But Michael and Paul here take it a step further and say a company's value is no more and no less than the decisions it makes and executes, which basically means that a company is a sum total of the decisions, and so decisions are really the meat of what makes a company successful or not. And the same holds true for products as well. And so the way we're going to structure our conversation today is, firstly, I want to just focus on some PM competencies and traits that make for being good decision facilitators. The second thing is I want to dive deeper into the process that I'm recommending as sort of the superset of a decision-making process that you can apply piecemeal or fully to a lot of different situations. And third, I want to focus on the application of this process in some real-world situations and how one can apply it again fully or in parts, and in situations that hopefully you've either already seen or probably will see in the future. All right, so let's dig into some successful PM traits and competencies that one has to have before we jump into the process elements that we're going to talk about. So you've heard this over and over again. PMs have to lead without formal authority, right? We have to, however, remain responsible for the quality and pace of the decision making itself, right? So this is a tough task, but also exciting. We're not responsible for making the decisions. I think this is a common misconception, and a lot of PMs assume that we're responsible for making the decisions. But I think I want to bust that myth. We're responsible, again, it's worth reiterating that we're responsible for the quality and the pace of the decisions that are made. And we're also, responsible and have the opportunity to shape the decision-making culture of the company by investing in the right amount of process. We have the opportunity to say, hey, with the right decision-making process, we're making sure that people are involved. We're making sure that the quality of the decision is high. We have the right amount of process, not too much, not too little, and we're able to do this at momentum and at speed. And so that's our charter, I think. So what are the competencies we need to have to be effective, right? I think there's three main ones. One is project management. A lot of what we have to do as facilitators is project management, really, right? Like, we have to make sure that we're able to define the process, we're able to add the right people to the process, and we're able to drive momentum. Secondly, we need to be extremely emotionally intelligent. Changes ultimately will have impact to people and teams. And ultimately, these teams are made up of humans. And humans have fears and motivations that we need to account for. If we don't, what we might end up doing is hampering the sort of culture and camaraderie in the team. And we don't want that, because it's not like we want to make just one good decision. We have to make hundreds and thousands of decisions. So making sure that we're taking everybody along and making them feel heard is super, super important. I think the final one is that we need to be comfortable with a little bit of tension and pushback and potentially even conflict. Ultimately, decisions that we might make could result in people feeling that they don't agree with it, and they might veto it or escalate it. And I think we have to be okay with that. We don't have to lose our cool. We have to be a little stoic about these things, and we need to be the coolest people in the room, and that's super, super important. So a few archetypes of PMs I've seen who even with we may act a certain way in certain situations is when we lack the project management discipline. So we're so agonizing so much about the right decision that we forget about ensuring that we have a process in place, that the right people are involved, and we're doing it at speed. So that's definitely one thing I've seen. And again, perfect is the enemy of good, and it's probably much better to take a decision and move on in most cases, because most decisions are reversible and you learn a lot by moving quickly. So it's better to focus on getting the decision done with the right amount of quality instead of getting to the best possible quality. The second piece is the hyper rational sort of PM, right? Like you think the data supports what you want to do, you believe the user research supports it, and so you're just like, you know what, I don't care about your fears and motivations to team X, and I'm just, this is what needs to happen and this is what's going to happen. And so you can be basically a bit of a steamroller, and again, as I mentioned earlier, that can affect team culture and again make for much worse decisions going forward because people already have this lack of trust. And the final one is what I like to call the avoider. If you're always looking for situations where there's very little pushback, we're probably not investing our time in decisions and projects and so on that have really high impact. So it's important for us to be willing to have those critical conversations so that we're focused on the highest value things, even if they're not the most comfortable in the given, in the present. And just to summarize this section, I think it's just important for us to challenge any limiting beliefs we have as individual PMs that can reduce our performance as great facilitators. Because ultimately, while we have to bring a lot of people along, it's going to be much harder if we have our own limiting beliefs that are coming in the way. So let's talk about the decision-making process itself. Again, this is a recommendation. There are different frameworks people use, but I've sort of tried and tested a lot of this, and this is what I use personally, and so hopefully this can be helpful to you all as well. The first part, when a decision lands on sort of, something lands on my desk that needs a decision, is, I need to understand the basic facets of the decision itself, right? How important is this decision? Is it something that's super critical, or is it something that, is important, but isn't sort of something that we need to tackle right away? The second piece is how quickly is a decision needed, right? There might be something that's super important, but isn't important for the next 6 months. And conversely, there might be something that probably is not super important, but we need to take a decision for it like really shortly. So that's important to know. And then, is it strategic or tactical? Is it something that is easily reversible? Is super important as well, because let's say an engineer comes to you and says, hey, I want to run this experiment. If it's a fairly easily reversible experiment, I mean, should we agonize over whether this is something we should run or not? Probably not, right? So it's important to understand those pieces so that you can then figure out what the best solution is and how you should triage the decision-making process. So let's say you determine that. The next thing is going to be, all right, let's start the process or figure out what subset of the process we want to actually tackle and take on. Or you might say, I want to delay making a decision on this. I'll make a decision on this, but it's not important for the next 2 weeks or the next month. So I'll come back to it and, set a reminder to do that. You may also not be the right person to actually drive this. So maybe it's ideal to delegate it to another team or another PM. Maybe it doesn't fall into the metrics that you own, and it's something that another PM should take on. Or maybe it's something that a completely separate department like marketing might or should ideally drive. So again, doing that is super important, and doing that earlier is better than later before you spend a lot of cycles on it. And make sure whatever you decide, since this is something that came to you, is widely communicated so that people can share their feedback on it, and at the very least, people are aware of what the next steps are. All right, let's dig into the process itself. Why is the process so important? We've talked about this a little bit, but ultimately it's because it increases the pace and quality of decision making. Pace because everybody now is aware of what the next steps are, and so nobody's wasting time figuring out like what's going to come next, right? And quality because if you have the right process, you've involved the right people, and having the right people and diverse sort of ideas in the room means that you're probably getting to a much better decision overall, and you're not missing out on pieces that you may not have thought of. It also builds ownership across teams, right? Involving people is important because they feel invested in the outcome of the decision, and they can then rally the resources needed to actually execute on the decision as well. And lastly, I think this is super important. It also reduces the odds of a last-minute veto. This has happened to all of us at some point or the other, I think. But basically, like when people don't feel involved in the process or feel that they have been sort of, they're hearing about it super late in the game, when a lot of the decisions have already been made, the odds of them reacting sort of instinctively and saying, you know what, I don't understand this, I don't agree with it, I'm just going to veto all of this, is super high. As opposed to if you've kept them involved throughout the process, they tend to not do that because it's also, I mean, if they have reservations, they highlight it up front. Again, it doesn't eliminate the possibility of this happening, but it greatly reduces the chance of it happening. So some of the things before we jump into the detailed pieces of the process, I think one thing to be super aware of is a few things that one should always do. Firstly, you should always have a decision tracker. So every decision, even if it's super small, typically has a list of sub decisions that need to be made. And making sure that there's a tracker that says, hey, these are the ones that are still open, these are the ones that are closed, is good, because it just puts a little bit of a finality to things and allows people to sort of move on to what's open. And also, if you work in a large company and there are a lot of different teams involved, it's also good to say who's aligned and who's not on the sub decisions. And that puts a little bit of a healthy pressure on, like, hey, look, there are these 10 people who are already in agreement. There are these 2 or 3 people who are not. And so you can just basically send them, link to that specific sub decision. People can look at it and take a call, leave comments, or whatever they want to do. The second piece is having a task tracker, right? Like ultimately you want all the contributors to the decision to know what they're responsible for and by when. And this just makes sure there's momentum in the process. And I think the last one is super important as well, which is you want to make sure that you're over communicating with the people that are involved, the contributors, but also people who should stay informed, leadership, and all possible teams that are important. The cadence can vary depending on, again, the importance of the decision, how quickly things are changing, and those things can be figured out, but it's important to make sure you're communicating more than less. All right, so what are the pieces of the process? I think there's basically 3. One, you want to make sure that you have the roles outlined and everybody agrees that the right people are involved as the drivers, the approvers, the contributors, and whoever needs to be informed, and make sure you have everybody listed and, again, in a central place that people can refer to. You want to make sure that the action items are super clear. We've talked about this, and the owners are absolutely well defined as well, and so are the timelines. So all of this should be straightforward. There are other frameworks you can use for the roles. The RACI is another one, but I tend to like this for decisions because it sort of has the pieces that I think are super important. All right, so what's next is ensuring that the team, once it's been defined, is super clear on the context, goals, and guardrails. I think this is probably the most important step after defining the process, because a lot of disagreements and misalignment happens because there's no disagreement in goals. So it's very hard to discuss solutions when 2 people are trying to maximize 2 very different things. It's also a good spot to actually escalate if 2 teams or 2 people are not aligned, and make sure that there is the leadership essentially weighs down and says, you know what, we are explicitly prioritizing goal 1 and not goal 2. So what's needed here? I think sharing data, just the context, any insights, any user feedback, all of that sort of stuff. Aligning on the success criteria. Typically 1 is best, but you could have 1 or 2. What are the guardrails and the countermetrics that you don't want to affect too much? And some of the constraints, like by when do we have to ship this, or maybe there's a cost component, we cannot spend more than X in terms of resources or something like that. So just making sure that everybody understands that will help in the process going forward. All right, now we get to sort of defining what are the problems you're solving and what are some solutions for that? And a tool I like for that is the double diamond. It's used mostly in the design context, and the idea, as you can see here, is you pick the right thing to design. So you're identifying the right problems to solve, and then you are trying to design things right. So you're solving it the right way and picking the right solutions. I think this can apply to basically many different types of decisions, and I think it's good because it has this diverge converge mechanism where when you're thinking about what problems to solve, you've heard all this user feedback, you've seen all the data, you still want to figure out what is the highest, most intense, and most commonly found problems that are the most worth solving, right? And you can make a list, and then you can converge, using a rubric that makes sense. And the same holds true for solutions. You can say like, all right, for these one or two problems that we've identified, what are the ways we can solve it? And then you can have a rubric for that to like narrow it down and say, all right, these are the top 2 or 3 or 4 things that we should do to solve it. And so that's how I recommend going through this. And we've talked about the problems and how you should share the data insights that help here, and definitely have your UXR teams, analytics teams, data science teams, product marketing teams, or any other teams that have a lot of the insights involved here, and they should be driving a lot of that. And then the team should align on what problems make the most sense. And obviously the folks I just mentioned can come up with their recommendations, and people can agree or challenge that. And then on the solution side, I think brainstorms are super useful. Ultimately, especially if you don't have a lot of pre-existing solutions already in your backlog or something like that, it's just good to have a brainstorm to generate a lot of options, but you can skip it if you already have solutions. And then you want to make sure you're picking the right prioritization rubric, right? This is again going to be informed by what success metrics you care about, and what guardrails you want to set in place, and effort and all of that sort of stuff. And so here are just 2 examples of prioritization matrices that you can use. You can use something that's super low fidelity, like a high, medium, low, or a t-shirt sizing type of thing, to sort of measure your options, or you can go even deeper or even more numeric if you want something where the accuracy is higher. And again, it depends on the importance of the decision. It depends on whether it's a strategic decision or an executional one. And again, if something's super high effort, you probably want to spend the time and do the rigor of actually setting up a more detailed matrix. Really here, the point is that depending on the intensity of or the importance of the decision, you want to make sure that leadership is roped in. And leadership may mean different things. It may be your leads of your department. It may mean, if you're in a small enough company, it may mean the CXOs, right? So what you want to do is make sure that you're sharing regular updates with the team and the leads, and especially if there's wide interest in the process. Sometimes, as product managers, and it's just human, as we're going through the motions of doing the day-to-day, and we're not left with a lot of time, these sort of things around communication tend to sometimes slip. But what you want to do is you want to, again, communicate regularly to avoid any of those last-minute vetoes or anything like that. And sometimes, again, coming back to the point about emotional intelligence and getting pushback from a set of people or a department or whatever, you probably want to also back channel and have a few one-on-one or one-to-few conversations where you're basically trying to solicit feedback, share your current thinking, that the team has come up with, and find ways to sort of calm nerves, but also potentially influence a decision in a way that can get their buy-in. Again, you have to be careful here because you don't want to always dilute sort of impact for consensus. It's a fine balance. It's an art ultimately, but if you can do some things that don't add a lot of time and make their lives easier, I recommend considering that. It's about being creative and balancing trade-offs. And obviously, finally, when you have a core team that is aligned on the final recommendations, it's good to maybe, again, depending on the importance of the decision, share a few different recommendations that you've come up with as a team. And that's usually better than one, because you can then have different sort of things where maybe you're maximizing the success metrics a lot, but it has, that option has a lot of countermetric impact as well. On the other end of the spectrum, you may have something that's more incremental, less of an impact on the success metric, but it also doesn't have much of an impact on the countermetrics and so on. So, and maybe is lower effort. So it's good to share a few different recommendations that the team has come up with, and potentially you might want to meet with the leadership to sort of get their opinions on this and have a discussion. And ultimately, where you want to land up is that everyone in a sort of approval capacity is sort of either in stage 1 or 2 in this diagram, right? They either endorse it wholeheartely, or they're like, what, I agree with it, I can't support it, I have some reservations but not really. You don't want the 3 and 4, and if you get 3 and 4, it's a question about whether those people are key approvers or not. But if they are, you then obviously have to address their concerns, or if you feel that it's a bit of a deadlock and requires escalation, you need to do that as well. So the final step is, you've the decision's done, people have signed off, you've got your marching orders. I wanted to touch on this because you should, you obviously have to then execute, but also I think it's important to report back and do a retrospective afterwards. Humans love closure. People want to know when they've played a role in something, they spend time on something. They want to know how it panned out. They want to know, did it go well? Did it not go well? And I think it's important to sort of share those findings from the execution widely, because it creates a culture of learning, creates a culture of trust, because no matter if it went well or not, we're sharing it, and we're all in this together. It creates a culture of celebration if things went well, like people feel invested to celebrate together. And and also doing that alongside sharing next steps about, okay, this went well, but here's how we're going to invest in this further, or not invest in this, or what are we doing going forward, is also important, because again, that creates a culture of learning and sharing and camaraderie. And I think, you can do this as a PM individually, but, may help to do this with a core group of people as well, to just say like, all right, how did the process actually go? Was this like too much overhead? Was it the right amount of process? What could we have changed? Were the right people involved or not? Did we have too many people? How could we get better in the future if you had the same exact type of decision come up that we have to make as well? So that's super important. And I think doing this will sharpen the skills of the product manager in question, but also improve the decision-making culture in the company. All right, so to round this off, I want to get into a few different real-world examples that you can use this framework in. So let's start by just looking at a summary of the decision-making process, right? It's these 6 steps. We talked about them, and how do you apply them in different situations? So let's look at like the roadmap situation. This is super common if you're a product manager. If you're developing a roadmap for the quarter or the half, you probably want to do all the steps that were outlined here, right? Like you don't want to skimp on any of them, because it's super important. It's a huge investment of time from a lot of different teams, and so you want to make sure that you're sort of covering all bases. Another place where you might want to do this is a high effort initiative. Like let's say something is going to take like 3 months, 4 months. It's a big systemic change for the company. You probably want to go through all of the steps in that case as well. What if there's a situation where somebody says, hey, revenue just fell 10%, we need to do something really, really quickly? In this situation, you obviously don't need to align on like a lot of process and a lot of, goal alignment, because the goal is like fixed revenue. But you do need to investigate why revenue is dropped. You do need to come up with solutions to reverse that trend, prioritize within that, and then make sure that everybody knows about what is being done, and you can get feedback on it, because again, this is super important. The whole company is super interested, right, to know how we're going to reverse this trend. Another scenario, and you can see that we're getting into situations where you can use less and less of the process, is you're working with your design team and your engineering team and others on how much scope should we include in a given feature. In that case, you still want to align on the goals, because what ends up happening at that executional level is everybody has like confirmation bias and like these pet things they want to do, including yourself. And so it's important to again think about the goals, right? Like what are we trying to maximize for, and also align on the constraints. Like maybe you only want to time box this to 2 weeks. So, how much can we get done in there? So aligning on that's important. Looking at the different options and prioritizing amongst them is super important. And in this case, you might choose to communicate depending on if it's an important enough feature or not, right? Like you might just consider that as part of the core team's charter, and so it doesn't have to be communicated externally to a lot of people. Another thing is like, hey, what do we work on in this sprint? And here again, you don't need a process, you don't need goal alignment. What you really need is making sure that everybody's aligned on what problems are worth solving in this sprint, and picking from the solutions you have. Hopefully you don't need to come up with new ones, but maybe you do, and then prioritizing within them to see what's the most important thing. And even the problem definition probably is skippable depending on how mature your planning process is. And finally, this is an interesting case where, let's say a CXO comes to you and says, hey, I know this thing is on the roadmap for next year, but I want us to do this now. And this is something where you probably can just have a one-on-one conversation with them, but you can still leverage like pieces of the process, right? You can basically say, hey, look, here are our goals for this half, and here are our goals for next half. Now, if you pull that in, that's an option, but this is what will suffer. We not do these things, and we believe that this will reduce our impact on our goals by so much, or something like that. And you can align on that, and then they may say, you know what, I still want to take that risk. And then make sure once you've gotten to that agreement, you've communicated widely so that everybody's aware about why it's happening and what the rationale was, and who sort of was the key approver of that decision. And I think the final thing I want to touch on is a few more people-related things to be mindful of as you work on a lot of different decisions, especially high-stake decisions. I think the first thing is inter-team dynamics, right? Like it's important to know that certain decisions, let's say you're automating something that earlier was done manually by another team, you're affecting the sort of headcount that they were going to have, right? That means that their influence is maybe going to reduce or change. Or potentially the reverse could be true. You could be doing something that increases customer support volume by 50%, and that increases the workload, and they don't want to support that and can't support it, or they can't ramp up resourcing that quickly, or whatever the case may be. It's important to be mindful of those sort of things. Philosophical misalignment. I've seen this happen quite a bit, especially when, let's say, you've picked a success metric and you've picked a counter metric. And let's say an example would be you want to prioritize growth, but that has an impact on customer experience. Or you were giving 10 benefits to customers, but you now want to just give 8 to save costs, or whatever the case may be. And fundamentally, people might say, you know what, I don't agree that that's the right call, because that may be short-term thinking. If you do this, it's going to have long-term impacts on retention and on word of mouth and all that sort of stuff. And I think those are very important conversations to have and should happen in sort of the goal-setting stage. And it's important to get that right. And I think finally, there's this. Poor leadership is not that rare, and poor leadership can mean you've escalated something and leadership is not taking a decision. They're sort of paralyzed. There's too many variables and folks aren't able to make a decision, or they're too involved in the minutiae. They're like, hey, give me an update every single hour on this decision, and I really want to know what's happening, and that's adding a lot of overhead and slowing everybody down, because everybody's just busy doing the overhead stuff and not focusing on moving the decision forward. In all these cases, and there's probably many different things, I think it's important to first start with assuming good intent. But when you see this happening, it's important to also escalate tactfully, right? You want to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to address these. But if you're not able to do that and there is deadlock, it's essential that you're escalating to your manager and beyond, but doing so tactfully. To get unblocked, because again, you're responsible for the pace and quality of decision making, and so it's important that you're using all the tools in your toolkit, but again, doing so tactfully. So on that note, we'll end there, and thank you again for listening, and hopefully some of this is helpful. Feel free to follow me on Medium or LinkedIn. I try to post content about product management on there every now and then, and yeah, look forward to staying in touch and all the best with your careers. Thank you.